Hello everybody. Our project is on ocular trauma, its risks, causes, consequences, and prevention via public policy. Ocular trauma is an important worldwide preventable public health problem. Up to 2.4 million ocular injuries are estimated to occur in the US alone each year. In a prospective observational study done in Scotland, it was found that ocular trauma required hospitalization in 8.14 per 100,000 people. But hospital-based studies can underestimate the true impact of ocular trauma in the population. Minor injuries such as superficial foreign body injuries and corneal abrasions, which can lead to vision-threatening complications, are often overlooked. In a study done in New England, Glynn et al. Found an annual incidence of 980 per 100,000 people. In the US, eye injury rates were highest among white males in their 20s. Risk factors also included alcohol and drug use. The rate of injury was highest for superficial injuries, foreign bodies, contusions, and open wounds. The Beaver Dam Eye study found that the cumulative lifetime prevalence and 5-year incidence of ocular trauma was 19.8% and 1.6%. Males had 4 times the prevalence of females. A multivariate analysis showed that 1/5 of white adult Americans more than 42 years of age residing in small towns who are blue-collar or do farm-related work reported more ocular trauma in their lifetime. This group also had 3 times more risk of experiencing ocular trauma again within the next 5 years. Based on the most recent CDC data, every day more than 2,000 U.S. workers receive some form of medical treatment due to work-related eye injury. The incidence rate in workplaces is low. 1 in 450 full-time workers, of which 80% were men. 70% of injury cases were contact or physical, and 26% were chemical exposure to harmful substances or environments. A 2-stage case series study was done in Australia. In the retrospective stage, 77.9% of ocular injuries were male, and 40.2% were work-related injuries where protective eyewear was present 27.6% of the time. In the prospective case, it showed 89.7% were male, and 45.8% were work-related injuries where protective eyewear was present 39% of the time. In both stages, the mean age was about 35 years of age. One study done in developing areas of India showed that young males were most affected by ocular injury, with the majority below age 30, and that men were 4 times as likely to sustain ocular injury than women. 34.1% were industrial work injuries, 84% were physical injuries, and 16% were chemical injuries. Industrial eye injuries make up 10% of work-related injuries, where 29% of those are ocular penetrating injuries. Safety eyewear may result in $59 million worth of savings in Australia alone. There is a great need to enforce safety eyewear. Eye trauma, due to occupational hazard, is still the leading cause of ocular injury around the world. There is a need to increase public awareness and enforce eye protection in the workplace. Patient demographic and occupational factors need to be targeted to reduce the burden of the disease.
And now we come to sports ocular injuries. A study in Canada looked at the prevalence of ocular injuries as a whole. As you can see, the prevalence of eye injuries was low at about 2%, and of these injuries, those related to sports was only about 8.6%. However, as the participation in sports increases, we can expect to see a rise in the incidence of sports-related eye injuries as well. Huffman's study looked at the rate of eye injuries among high school athletes during the school years of 2005 to 2006 and 2006 to 2007. More specifically, they looked at the rate of rare injuries and conditions, which is defined as an uncommon or an unusual condition that included eye injuries, dental injuries, neck and cervical injuries, and dehydration and heat illnesses. Therefore, it is not unexpected that these rare injuries only accounted for 3.5% of all injuries during these school years. And of this 3.5%, 0.4% were ocularly related. They were also more associated with certain high-risk sports, such as baseball and basketball. A 4-year prospective cohort study compared injury rates of men and women's lacrosse players. Men field players wear mandatory protective equipment, while women have minimal protective gear. In fact, protective eyewear was not mandated for women's lacrosse players until the mid to late 2000s. Therefore, it is not surprising that they found in the study that the rate of injuries to the face, and thus the eyes, was higher in women than in men. There is definitely a need for proper education of these athletes and their trainers to help reduce the incidence of this highly preventable occurrence of eye injuries. And now we will look at pediatric ocular injuries. This study on eye injury-related hospitalizations of individuals 20 and under found that the rate of such hospitalizations was 8.9 per 100,000 hospitalizations. These individuals tended to be male and were between the ages of 18 and 20. Such hospitalizations do impose a financial burden, which further emphasizes the need for proper patient education to help prevent these eye injuries that require much more involved treatment and care. A study from Scotland on eye injuries in children further stresses that ocular injuries can be potentially serious and can lead to significantly reduced best-corrected visual acuity or even blindness. 10.7% of the patients in this study had a final best-corrected VA of 2200 or worse in the injured eye, which was what they defined as a blinding condition. It also brought up the fact that many eye injuries are actually preventable. As more of these injuries occur at home than at the workplace or anywhere else, proper education of the public could help to reduce future occurrences. As we see in these next few studies, a penetrating eye injury can lead to endophthalmitis, which results in a worse prognosis, particularly for the final best corrected VA. Final prognosis was found to be largely influenced by initial entering VA, wound location, wound size, and the sharpness of the mechanism of injury. Treatment options such as vitrectomy did not improve VA. However, it reduced the likelihood of needing enucleation in the future. An Iranian case series confirmed these findings, concluding that low initial best-corrected VA, vitrectomy, and retinal detachment were associated with a significantly reduced final best-corrected VA of 2200 or worse. And finally, in a U.S. military study, it was found that closed globe injuries tended to have more favorable visual outcomes than open globe injuries. Having an open globe injury was found to be one of the greatest risk factors for a final best corrected VA of worse than 2200.
With such high prevalences of ocular injury, several studies were done to determine the effectiveness of preventative measures in the workplace. A review study did a comparison between 3 types of interventions. The first intervention was a policy change that consisted of screening, education, and providing glasses at no additional charge. This resulted in full compliance 8 weeks into the program. Although the effect decreased after 15 weeks, it had a tremendous impact on the reduction of injuries, lost work time, and the amount of required medical care. The other 2 intervention types were the promise card and positive reinforcement. Neither of these studies showed enough improvement to have statistical significance. OSHA is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and it requires employers to provide eye protection and training, with the type of protection varying depending on the nature of the work. 25 states, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands have OSHA-approved state plans and have adopted their own standards and enforcement policies. The Saddle Creek Corporation implemented OSHA standards for eye protection in 2001, and while their work hours increased about threefold, the number of injuries decreased 500%, and its workers' compensation costs went from a high of $7,100 in 2001 to $1,700 in 2005. We will now look at the epidemiology of ocular trauma abroad. In the United States, the annual incidence was estimated to be 13.2 per 100,000. In Scotland, the annual incidence was 8.1 per 100,000, while in Australia, the annual incidence was estimated to be 15.2 per 100,000. However, differences in ocular injury definition and research strategies limit direct comparison of rates of ocular injury between different countries. In Australia, a population-based cross-sectional study was done describing the prevalence and risk factors of ocular trauma in a representative sample of Australians aged 40 and over. Overall rate of eye injury history was 21.1%, with a 95% confidence interval of 19.6% to 22.5%. Men were far more likely than women to have ever experienced an eye injury, and rural men were more likely than Melbourne men to have ever had an eye injury. Workplace accounted for the majority of eye injuries, 60%, followed by home, recreation, travel, and sport. The location with the highest percent of people reporting the use of eye protection at the time of injury was the workplace, and the workplace accounted for the lowest rate of hospitalization. In Singapore, a population-based incidence study was done involving all Singapore citizens and permanent residents. From 1991 to 1996, the overall annual incidence rate of hospitalized ocular injury was 12.6 per 100,000, and the annual incidence rate of open globe injury was 3.7 per 100,000. Men had fourfold higher rates of injury than women. And there was a bimodal age pattern of ocular injury with a peak in injury rates in young adults and in other people over 70 years. Indian men who held more blue-collar jobs had twice the risks than either Chinese or Malay men. In Scotland, a prospective observational study on ocular trauma resulting in hospital admission showed that males accounted for 83% of injuries. 54.4% of injuries were due to blunt trauma. The most common place for injury was at home, which accounted for 30.2%. Tools or machinery were the most common cause of injury, and it accounted for 24.4%. Only 62% of patients were aware of the risk of injury. This shows that awareness for risk of injury at home and at sports facilities is increasingly important because most safety and prevention is done at the workplace. In rural Nepal, a prospective study on epidemiology of ocular trauma showed a crude incidence of 0.51 per 1,000 population were at risk per year, with a confidence interval of 0.47 to 0.56. The most common type of injury was laceration at 73.3%, and the most common place of injury was at home at 32%. The first place that people sought eye care would be at the primary eye clinic or at a local pharmacy.